The morning of St. Mary Mead's annual Harvest Charity Tea dawned with the peculiar brightness that September sometimes bestows upon English villages, as if apologizing in advance for the gloom to come. Miss Jane Marple adjusted her sensible hat and surveyed the village green, where white marquees fluttered like oversized handkerchiefs against the ancient oak trees. The air carried the mingled scents of fresh-baked scones, late roses, and something else, a sweet, herbal fragrance that seemed oddly out of season. Mrs. Dolly Bantry bustled past with an armload of bunting, her cheeks flushed with the excitement of organization. "Jane, dear, have you seen Lavinia Ashford this morning? She promised to bring her famous lavender shortbread, but there's been no sign of her." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused in their gentle rhythm. "How unusual. Mrs. Ashford is generally most punctual about her commitments." She had noticed, though she didn't mention it, that Lavinia's cottage chimney had been smoking quite vigorously at dawn, rather excessive for such a mild morning, and with that distinctive sweet smell that suggested more than ordinary household refuse. The harvest tea was one of those cherished village traditions that brought together all of St. Mary Mead's residents, from the most respectable to the merely tolerated. Colonel Weatherby had positioned himself strategically near the beer tent, his military bearing somewhat undermined by his obvious intention to sample the local brew. Young Dr. Haydock moved through the crowd with professional bonhomie, though Miss Marple noticed his eyes lingered rather too long on the attractive widow, Mrs. Cynthia Dane, who had recently taken the lease on Rose Cottage. Mrs. Dane herself was a study in careful elegance, her dress perfectly pressed, her smile precisely calibrated for village society, yet something in her manner suggested a woman walking on eggshells. She stood near the cake stall, making appropriate admiring noises about Mrs. Price's Victoria sponge, but her gaze kept drifting toward the lane that led to Lavinia Ashford's cottage. "Such a shame about Mrs. Ashford's absence," Mrs. Dane murmured to the vicar's wife. "I do hope nothing's amiss. I saw her yesterday evening, walking toward the post office with quite a large bundle of letters. She seemed distressed." Miss Marple's ears, despite their 70-odd years, remained remarkably acute. She filed away this observation while continuing to knit, her fingers moving with the automatic precision that allowed her mind to focus entirely on the human drama unfolding around her. Gerald Ashford, Lavinia's nephew and sole heir, had arrived from London on the morning train, his city clothes marking him as distinctly out of place among the tweeds and florals of village attire. He moved through the crowd with barely concealed impatience, accepting condolences on his aunt's absence with a sort of tight smile that suggested family obligations, weighing heavily upon him. "Aunt Lavinia has been rather preoccupied lately," he explained to anyone who asked. "Some business matters requiring her attention. Nothing serious, I'm sure." But Miss Marple observed the way his hands trembled slightly as he lit his cigarette, and how his eyes avoided direct contact with Mrs. Dane, who seemed equally determined to avoid acknowledging his presence. The first sign of real trouble came when young Tommy Fletcher, the postman's son, came running across the green with the sort of excitement that only genuine catastrophe can inspire in a 12-year-old boy. "There's smoke coming from Mrs. Ashford's cottage," he announced breathlessly. "Proper thick smoke, not like a chimney fire at all." Several of the men immediately set off toward Lavender Lane, led by Colonel Weatherby, who had sobered remarkably quickly. Miss Marple followed at her own measured pace, her knitting tucked safely into her capacious handbag, her mind already turning over the implications of smoke, absent hostesses, and the subtle tensions she had observed. They found Lavinia Ashford's cottage door standing wide open, unusual for a woman who valued her privacy above almost all else. The sitting room bore signs of hasty activity. Drawers pulled open, papers scattered, and in the fireplace, the still warm ashes of what had clearly been a substantial bonfire of correspondence. But it was in the back garden, among the lavender bushes that gave the cottage its distinctive fragrance, that they made the discovery that would transform a pleasant charity tea into something far more sinister. Lavinia Ashford lay peacefully among her beloved plants, her gardening gloves still on her hands, her face serene in death. Beside her, partially hidden beneath a lavender bush, lay a small pile of letters tied with purple ribbon, letters that had somehow escaped the flames that had consumed their companions. Dr. Haydock knelt beside the still form, his examination brief but thorough. "She's been dead several hours," he announced quietly. "Possibly since last evening." Miss Marple bent carefully to examine the rescued letters, noting their distinctive lavender-tinted paper and the elegant handwriting that adorned the visible envelope. The postmark was recent, and the return address, though partially obscured, appeared to be from London. As the constable was summoned and the inevitable formalities began, Miss Marple stood quietly among the lavender, breathing in the sweet, familiar scent that would forever after remind her of secrets burned but not entirely destroyed, and of the curious fact that someone had taken considerable care to ensure these particular letters survived the flames that had consumed all the others. The game, as she had learned to think of it, had begun once again. Constable Barnes arrived within the hour, his bicycle bell announcing his approach long before his flushed face appeared around the bend of Lavender Lane. He was a conscientious man, if somewhat overwhelmed by the gravity of the situation, and he set about securing the scene with the methodical precision that had served him well in 20 years of village policing. Miss Marple remained quietly near the garden path, her knitting needles resuming their gentle rhythm, her presence so unobtrusive that she might have been part of the cottage's furnishings. Dr. Haydock's preliminary examination revealed no obvious signs of violence, though his professional demeanor carried an undertone of uncertainty. "Natural causes, most likely," he murmured to Barnes, crouching beside Lavinia's still form. She was 73, and she'd been complaining of dizzy spells lately. Perhaps a heart episode while she was tending her garden. Yet his eyes kept returning to the scattered papers visible through the cottage's open door and to the small bundle of letters that lay so precisely beneath the lavender bush. Miss Marple found herself studying the arrangement of the scene with the sort of attention she might give to a particularly complex knitting pattern. Something about Lavinia's positioning struck her as oddly deliberate. One hand reaching toward the lavender bush, her gardening gloves still pristine, her basket dropped as if in sudden distress. Yet the letters had been carefully preserved, their purple ribbon tied with a slightly uneven knot that suggested a left-handed person's work. Gerald Ashford had arrived shortly after the constable, his London clothes marking him as distinctly out of place among the gathering villagers. His face bore the appropriate expression of grief, though Miss Marple detected something else beneath it, a relief that seemed disproportionate to the loss of a beloved aunt. "Poor Aunt Lavinia," he said, accepting condolences with practiced ease. "She lived for her garden. In a way, it's fitting that she should have passed away among her beloved lavender." Mrs. Cynthia Dane stood at the garden gate, her earlier composure having quite deserted her. She twisted her handkerchief between trembling fingers as she spoke to Mrs. Bantry. "It's such a shock. I saw her only yesterday evening, as I mentioned. She seemed perfectly well, if rather agitated about something. She was carrying those letters, and she seemed quite upset. She mentioned something about setting things right, but wouldn't elaborate when I asked if I could help." The village, once the initial shock wore off, began to hum with speculation. Mrs. Bantry, ever the purveyor of information, offered her theory to anyone who would listen. "It must have been burglars, you know. Lavinia always kept a tidy sum in her biscuit tin. And those letters, they must have been looking for something valuable, and poor Lavinia disturbed them." This explanation gained traction among those who preferred external threats to the more unsettling possibility of internal village secrets. Colonel Weatherby, his military bearing reasserting itself, had taken it upon himself to question the assembled neighbors. Most claimed to have been at home the previous evening, though Mrs. Dane admitted to taking a late walk past the cottage around 9 o'clock. The cottage was dark, she explained, and I assumed Mrs. Ashford had retired early. Young Dr. Haydock frowned at this information. That's rather unusual. Lavinia was quite the night owl. She often mentioned staying up late to read or tend to correspondence. His observation sent a ripple of unease through the gathered villagers, as if this small deviation from routine carried more weight than a simple change of habit. Miss Marple, meanwhile, had noticed several details that seemed to escape official attention. The cottage's back gate showed signs of having been wedged open. A small, broken sprig lodged under the latch suggested someone who wished to pass, without the telltale click being heard. In the fireplace, among the thoroughly burnt papers, a small droplet of hardened wax caught the light. Sealing wax, impressed with what might once have been a signet ring's pattern, now melted beyond recognition. Inspector Slack arrived from the county town with characteristic energy, his sharp eyes immediately taking in the scene's inconsistencies. He listened to Barnes's report, examined the body with professional detachment, and studied the fireplace with the sort of attention that made Gerald Ashford shift uncomfortably. Letters, Slack observed. Burned correspondence, yet some carefully preserved, and a nephew arriving on the morning train. Mrs. Ashford had money, did she? Gerald flushed deeply. There is no, my aunt was not. She was sound in mind. She had certain papers, family matters that required attention. His protest came too quickly, with the practiced ease that suggested rehearsal. Family matters that needed burning? Slack's tone was not unkind, merely relentless. Who burned them, Mr. Ashford? You were seen in the village before the tea. Mrs. Riley sold you cigarettes at 9:30. I came straight from the station to fetch my bag, Gerald protested. No one answered when I knocked. I didn't. Good God, do you think I would burn my aunt's letters while she lay? He turned away, pressing his hand to his mouth in apparent distress. Mrs. Dane's voice, light but unsteady, cut through the tension. Inspector, Mrs. Ashford posted letters last night. I saw her with a bundle. She looked shaken, as if she'd received disturbing news. I thought it best not to intrude. Posted them? Slack turned his attention to her. How many? A dozen, perhaps. Lavender paper, tied with ribbon. It seemed very particular, almost ceremonial. Miss Marple's gaze drifted back to the fireplace, then to the surviving letters. The postmistress would need to be questioned, of course, but already a pattern was emerging. Letters sent, letters burned, letters preserved. Someone had been very selective about which correspondence should survive and which should not. As the official proceedings continued, the village gradually returned to its interrupted festivities, though the harvest tea had lost much of its celebratory atmosphere. Children, warned away from the cottage, resumed their games with the brittle brightness of those who sense adult anxiety without understanding its source. Mrs. Dane approached Miss Marple hesitantly as the crowd began to disperse. Miss Marple, might I have a word? I'm rather concerned about something, and I'm not sure whether I should mention it to the inspector. Miss Marple's needles paused in their rhythm, her pale blue eyes focusing with gentle attention. Of course, my dear. What's troubling you? Mrs. Dane glanced around to ensure they wouldn't be overheard, then leaned closer. It's about those letters, the ones beneath the lavender bush. Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. I think I may have seen them before. The handwriting, the lavender paper. I believe they were written by someone I once knew. Someone who should have been dead these past 5 years. Miss Marple's knitting needles stilled completely as she regarded Mrs. Dane with the sort of careful attention she might give to a particularly intricate stitch. The younger woman's face had grown quite pale, and her hands trembled as she clutched her handkerchief. There was something in her expression that spoke of old fears suddenly awakened, of carefully buried secrets threatening to surface like weeds in a well-tended garden. Someone who should have been dead, Miss Marple repeated gently, her voice carrying no judgment, merely the invitation to continue. She had learned, through decades of village life, that the most extraordinary revelations often emerged from the most ordinary conversations, particularly when people found themselves shaken by unexpected events. Mrs. Dane glanced nervously toward the cottage, where Inspector Slack could be seen through the window, methodically examining the contents of Lavinia's desk. Perhaps I'm mistaken. It's been so long, and shock can play tricks on one's memory. But that handwriting, it's so distinctive, you see. Bold capitals on the envelopes, a small quirk to the letter R, and the way the Y tails curve back on themselves. She paused, seeming to gather her courage before continuing. My late husband, wrote precisely so. Captain Lawrence Dane. He disappeared 5 years ago in the Dolomites during a climbing expedition. There was no body recovered, only his final letters to me and the official presumption of death. But if those letters are in his hand... Her voice trailed off, the implications too overwhelming to voice completely. Miss Marple absorbed this information with the careful attention of someone assembling a complex puzzle. And you knew Mrs. Ashford at the time of your husband's disappearance? Only by reputation, then. We met properly when I came to lease Rose Cottage 6 months ago, but Lawrence had mentioned her. He lodged here in the village for a summer years before we married, when Mrs. Ashford took paying guests. He remembered her kindness. If he were somehow alive, it wouldn't be unnatural that he might turn to an old acquaintance. Not unnatural at all, Miss Marple murmured. I think we must learn what precisely went into the post last night. One understands a pattern much better when one knows the entire stitch, but I should be cautious and tell no one for the present. Mrs. Dane nodded gratefully, and Miss Marple, after seeing her settled with Mrs. Bantry, announced that she needed stamps and set off toward the post office with the unhurried gait of an elderly lady avoiding unnecessary exertion. Her eyes, however, were bright with interest. The post office, presided over by Mrs. Amelia Ferris, who kept her spectacles on a chain and her information well polished, brightened at Miss Marple's approach. "A sad business, ma'am." "Poor Mrs. Ashford. Such a regular customer. What can I do for you?" "6-penny stamps would be very pleasant," Miss Marple said, laying coins on the counter with careful exactitude. "And if it is not indelicate, Mrs. Ferris, did Mrs. Ashford happen to pass by here yesterday evening?" "She did indeed. A little after 8, I should say. Brought a bundle of letters, tied with a purple ribbon the way she always fancied. There was one registered, London address, a solicitor's firm, Ellison and Brightwell, if memory serves. She was in a state, Miss Marple. Pale as milk and very particular that I stamp everyone before closing." This information sent a small thrill through Miss Marple's orderly mind. A registered letter to solicitors suggested legal matters of some urgency. "How many letters in total, would you say?" "A dozen, perhaps more. And there's another thing. There was a gentleman waiting at the corner when she left. City coat, proper umbrella, looked London to me. I couldn't see his face for the brim, but she joined him, and they spoke a moment before going on toward the lane." Miss Marple thanked Mrs. Ferris and made her way back toward the cottage, her mind turning over these new details. A mysterious gentleman, legal correspondence, and Mrs. Dane's startling revelation about her supposedly deceased husband all pointed toward complications far beyond a simple village death. She arrived to find Dr. Haydock emerging from the cottage, his medical bag in hand, and his expression deeply troubled. Inspector Slack followed close behind, his notebook prominent and his manner suggesting unwelcome discoveries. "Inspector," Dr. Haydock was saying, "I've completed my preliminary examination, and I'm afraid I must revise my initial assessment. While I cannot rule out natural causes entirely, there are certain inconsistencies that concern me greatly." "What sort of inconsistencies?" Slack's attention sharpened immediately. "The position of the body, for one thing. Mrs. Ashford appears to have fallen forward among the lavender, yet her gardening gloves show no soil on the palms, as one would expect if she had tried to break her fall. Additionally, there's a slight discoloration around her lips that might suggest, though I cannot be certain without a proper post-mortem. Some form of poisoning. The word poisoning seemed to electrify the small gathering. Gerald Ashford, who had been standing quietly near the garden gate, stepped backward as if physically struck. Poisoning. But who would want to harm Aunt Lavinia? She was the most harmless person imaginable. Mr. Ashford, Inspector Slack said, his tone taking on a more official quality. I understand you're Mrs. Ashford's sole heir. A substantial inheritance, I'm told. The cottage, her savings, and considerable investments. Gerald's discomfort was evident. I knew she was comfortable, but I had my own life in London, my own concerns. Aunt Lavinia was always very private about her financial affairs. Miss Marple, observing this exchange, noticed how Mrs. Dane had grown even paler, her knuckles white where she gripped her handbag. But it was something else that caught her attention, a small detail that others might easily overlook. Mrs. Dane's right hand bore a faint, reddish mark just above the knuckle, almost like a burn, hardly noticeable unless one was looking for such things. Mrs. Dane, Miss Marple said gently, approaching the younger woman, you mentioned seeing Mrs. Ashford yesterday evening with those letters. Did she seem particularly distressed about anything specific? Mrs. Dane's eyes darted nervously between Miss Marple and the inspector. She seemed urgent, yes, as if she had something important to accomplish. She mentioned something about setting things right, but wouldn't elaborate when I offered to help. And you were taking an evening walk at that time? Yes, I often walk in the evenings. It helps me sleep. Mrs. Dane's voice was steady, but Miss Marple noticed how she unconsciously moved her marked hand behind her back. Inspector Slack, meanwhile, had been studying Gerald with the focused attention of a man building a case. Mr. Ashford, you'll need to remain in the village while we complete our inquiries, and I'll want a detailed account of your movements yesterday evening. As the official proceedings continued, Miss Marple found herself drawn back to the preserved letters beneath the lavender bush. The selective preservation troubled her. Why save these particular letters while burning all the others? And Mrs. Dane's revelation about her husband's handwriting added another layer to an already complex puzzle. Later, as the crowd began to disperse, Mrs. Dane approached Miss Marple once more, her composure finally cracking. Miss Marple, there's something else I must tell you. Something I couldn't say in front of the inspector. Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. I received one of those lavender letters myself a week ago. The handwriting was definitely Lawrence's, and he asked me to meet him in the churchyard by the old yew tree at dusk last night. Miss Marple felt the familiar stirring that came when pieces of a puzzle began to align. And did you keep this appointment, my dear? Mrs. Dane's silence was answer enough, but her eyes held secrets that Miss Marple suspected would prove crucial to understanding what had really happened in Lavinia Ashford's garden on that September evening. Mrs. Dane's admission hung in the evening air like the lingering scent of lavender, sweet yet somehow ominous. Miss Marple guided her to the wooden bench beneath the ancient oak, where they could speak without attracting Inspector Slack's attention. The younger woman's composure, so carefully maintained throughout the day, finally began to crumble like a dam giving way to long-held waters. You went to meet him, Miss Marple said gently, her knitting needles resuming their quiet rhythm. It was not a question, but rather an invitation to unburden herself of secrets that had clearly grown too heavy to carry alone. Mrs. Dane nodded, her hands trembling as she smoothed her skirt. I had to know, Miss Marple. 5 years of believing him dead, of rebuilding my life from nothing, of learning to sleep without wondering if he might still be alive somewhere. When that letter came, written in his unmistakable hand, asking me to meet him by the old yew tree, how could I refuse? And he was there. He was. The words came out in a rush now, as if speaking them quickly might somehow lessen their impact. Older, much thinner, with a beard I didn't recognize, but unmistakably Lawrence. He told me the most extraordinary story, how the climbing accident had been staged, how he'd been in terrible financial difficulty, deeply in debt to some very dangerous people. He said he saw no other way out but to disappear completely. Miss Marple's needles paused momentarily. A desperate measure indeed, and what brought him back to St. Mary Mead? He said he'd been living abroad under another name, but something had gone wrong. He was being pursued. He wouldn't say by whom, and he needed money desperately to disappear again. He remembered Mrs. Ashford from years ago when he'd lodged here briefly. She had been kind to him then, and he thought she might help without asking too many questions. Mrs. Dane's voice grew smaller, more uncertain. But there was something different about him, Miss Marple. Harder, more calculating than the man I'd married. He seemed remarkably well dressed for someone claiming to have been living in poverty. His coat was of excellent quality, his shoes barely worn. And when he reached for my hand, she unconsciously touched the small red mark on her knuckle. He wore a signet ring I'd never seen before. The metal was quite warm, as if he'd been holding it near a flame, and it burned me when he touched me. This detail sent a small thrill through Miss Marple's orderly mind, connecting immediately to the melted sealing wax she had observed in Lavinia's fireplace. Did he explain the ring? He became evasive when I asked, said it was a gift from people who had helped him, but Miss Marple, he seemed so desperate, almost frantic. He kept checking his watch, pacing about, saying he had to see the old woman again before it was too late. When I told him I couldn't help him, that I had no money to spare and wouldn't be party to whatever deception he was planning, he grew quite angry. He left me there suddenly, heading toward Lavender Lane. Miss Marple absorbed this information with the careful attention of someone assembling a complex puzzle. Mrs. Dane, you mentioned he asked about old letters of his that you might have kept. Did you tell him about burning them? Yes, and he became furious. Said I'd ruined his last chance at something, though he wouldn't explain what. He seemed to think they might have been useful as proof of his identity, perhaps to leverage money from someone else. Mrs. Dane's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Miss Marple, do you think he might have... Could he have harmed Mrs. Ashford? Before Miss Marple could respond, Inspector Slack emerged from the cottage, his expression grim and his notebook prominent. He carried with him a small leather journal and several fragments of partially burned paper. Mrs. Dane, he called, his voice carrying the weight of official suspicion. I believe we need to discuss these diary entries I've found. Mrs. Ashford appears to have been quite concerned about someone she refers to only as L.D. The entries suggest she was being pressured, possibly even threatened. The effect on both Mrs. Dane and Gerald Ashford, who had been hovering near the garden gate, was immediate and dramatic. Mrs. Dane went pale, while Gerald's cigarette fell from suddenly nerveless fingers. The entries span several months, Slack continued, consulting his notes. They speak of mounting pressure, of demands for money, of fears for her safety. The final entry, dated yesterday, is particularly telling. LD grows more desperate. I fear I have helped create a monster. Must end this tonight, whatever the cost. Gerald Ashford stepped forward, his face a mask of barely controlled anxiety. Inspector, surely you don't think... I mean, if this Lawrence person was pressuring Aunt Lavinia, threatening her... Mr. Ashford, Slack interrupted, I understand you've been in London recently. Can you account for your whereabouts yesterday evening? I was on the evening train, as I told you. I have my ticket stub. I arrived this morning and came straight to the cottage when no one answered my knock. Gerald's protest came too quickly, with the practiced ease that suggested rehearsal. Miss Marple, meanwhile, had been observing the interplay of expressions and reactions with her characteristic attention to human nature. Something about Gerald's nervous energy, combined with Mrs. Dane's revelation about the signet ring, was forming a pattern in her mind. Inspector, she said quietly, if I might suggest, it would be most helpful to speak with the Reverend Clement. I believe he may have encountered this mysterious gentleman yesterday evening. When questioned, the vicar confirmed that a well-spoken man with city manners had indeed asked for directions to Lavender Lane just after 8 o'clock. proper gentleman he seemed, though I couldn't see his face clearly in the evening light. He carried an umbrella despite the clear weather. This corroboration sent a visible shudder through Mrs. Dane, while Gerald Ashford lit another cigarette with hands that trembled slightly. Miss Marple noticed, as she always noticed small things, that he used his left hand to strike the match and shook it out with an outward flick rather than the more common inward pinch. As the official proceedings continued and the village gradually returned to its interrupted routine, Miss Marple excused herself for a brief walk. Her steps led her naturally to the churchyard, where the ancient yew cast its familiar shadows in the gathering dusk. Near the old table tomb she paused, not bending, there was no need to strain a back that had earned its comfort, but letting her eyes wander as if admiring the weathered stone. Just below the niche Mrs. Dane had mentioned, a tiny bead of something had hardened against the weathered stone. She touched it lightly with a gloved finger. It flaked away like brittle sugar. Sealing wax, she was certain, and of a peculiar shade. Neither red nor brown, but the faint violet that fashionable stationers had lately affected. On the path beyond the wall, a narrow scrape in the packed earth told of a heel turned hastily, and in the hedge there was the smallest tear where a twig had been snapped cleanly, as if a sleeve had caught and been snatched away. As she walked slowly back toward the village, Miss Marple's mind turned over the accumulating evidence like a patient gardener examining soil before planting. The pattern was becoming clearer, though its full implications remained troubling. Letters burned, but some preserved, a mysterious gentleman with an umbrella, a signet ring warm from flame, and a left-handed knot beneath the lavender bushes. By the time she reached her cottage gate, she had begun to suspect that the truth about Lavinia Ashford's death lay not in the obvious explanation of a desperate man's return, but in something far more complex and closer to home. The game, as she had learned to think of these matters, was approaching its most dangerous phase, the moment when the guilty party realizes that their carefully constructed deception is beginning to unravel. Tomorrow, she reflected, would likely bring revelations that would shake St. Mary Mead to its very foundations. Morning brought with it the peculiar clarity that often follows village upheavals, as if the very air sought to settle the dust of human complications. Miss Marple rose at her customary hour and found herself drawn to her sitting-room window, where she could observe the quiet drama unfolding around Lavender Cottage. The morning light revealed Inspector Slack's methodical approach to the investigation. Small flags marked where evidence had been collected, and the cottage itself had taken on the official air of a crime scene rather than a home. What caught her attention immediately was the restless figure of Gerald Ashford pacing outside the garden gate, his city clothes rumpled from what had clearly been a sleepless night. Every few minutes he would glance toward Rose Cottage, where Mrs. Dane's windows remained firmly shuttered despite the advancing morning. There was something in his manner that spoke of a man wrestling with decisions rather than simply grieving an aunt's passing. Miss Marple's contemplation was interrupted by Constable Barnes, who appeared at her gate with the apologetic air of a man required by duty to disturb a gentlewoman's morning routine. "Beg pardon, Miss Marple. Inspector Slack wondered if you might spare a moment to examine those letters we found. He values your impressions." At the makeshift incident room that had been established in Lavender Cottage's sitting room, Inspector Slack looked as though he had not slept at all, which spoke well of his dedication. The rescued bundle of letters lay on the scarred wooden table, their purple ribbon still neatly tied with that peculiar left-handed knot Miss Marple had noted earlier. "I don't like puzzles that smell of lavender," Slack admitted with characteristic bluntness. "They usually mean sentiment somewhere, and sentiment hides motives better than smoke." He gestured toward the letters with evident frustration. All in the same hand, addressed only with initials, CD on one, GA on another. No stamps, so not for posting. Found under the bush as if someone wanted them discovered. Before Miss Marple could respond, Barnes entered with a telegram that immediately commanded Slack's attention. The inspector read it quickly, his expression shifting from frustration to grim satisfaction. "Ellison and Brightwell," he announced. The registered letter Mrs. Ashford posted contained instructions for a codicil to her will. She was to attend their office today to sign it. The codicil creates a trust, income to Mrs. Cynthia Dane for life, conditional on settlement of an outstanding debt to someone identified only as L.D. The solicitors add that their client expressed urgency and fear, requesting protective steps should anything befall her. This revelation sent Miss Marple's mind racing along new pathways. A legal document that would benefit Mrs. Dane while acknowledging a debt to the mysterious L.D. It suggested complications far beyond simple inheritance disputes. Their discussion was interrupted by the arrival of Mary Crouch, Lavinia's daily help, whose cap sat askew and whose hands worried the handle of her basket with obvious distress. "Inspector, begging your pardon, but I thought you should know. Yesterday afternoon, Mrs. Ashford had me polish the silver and lay out her good stationery. The lavender paper. She made me fetch the sealing wax, the violet kind, and the old stamp from the drawer. The one with the original Mr. Ashford's initials, G.A. She laughed about it, said the nephew would be amused to see it used again. Mary's testimony was interrupted by Dr. Haydock's arrival, his medical bag in hand and his expression deeply troubled. "Inspector, I've completed a more thorough examination and I must revise my assessment considerably. Mrs. Ashford wasn't fatally poisoned, but she had been given digitalis, foxglove extract, in a dose calculated to disorient rather than kill. The actual cause of death was a blow to the head, slight but fatal when combined with her weakened state." The implications of this medical revelation were staggering. Someone with considerable knowledge had administered just enough poison to make Lavinia confused and compliant, then delivered a carefully calculated blow that would appear accidental. It spoke of a killer far more sophisticated than a desperate, returning husband. Miss Marple excused herself for what she described as a necessary errand, but her steps led her directly to Mrs. Ferris at the post office. "Mrs. Ferris, about that gentleman who met Mrs. Ashford yesterday evening, could you recall any additional details? His manner of walking, perhaps, or which hand he favored?" Mrs. Ferris, delighted to be consulted on such an important matter, pushed her spectacles up her nose thoughtfully. "Well, he was tall and carried himself with military bearing, but there was something. He held his umbrella in his left hand, I distinctly remember, and when he tipped his hat to Mrs. Ashford, that was with his left hand as well. Most particular about it, he seemed. Left-handed, like Gerald Ashford." Miss Marple filed this observation away carefully, along with the growing certainty that the obvious solution was not necessarily the correct one. Her return to the cottage coincided with a scene of considerable drama. Mrs. Dane had emerged from Rose Cottage looking haggard and distressed, and was engaged in what appeared to be an intense conversation with Gerald Ashford near the garden gate. Their exchange ended with Mrs. Dane shaking her head emphatically and Gerald grasping her arm in what might have been either plea or threat. Inspector Slack emerged from the cottage at that moment, carrying what appeared to be an official telegram. His expression was grim as he approached the pair. "Mrs. Dane, Mr. Ashford, I'm afraid I have some rather startling news. We've been in communication with the Brighton police regarding Captain Lawrence Dane." Mrs. Dane went very pale, her hand moving instinctively to her throat. "Brighton? But Lawrence is... He disappeared in the Dolomites." "Captain Dane is very much alive, Mrs. Dane. He's been living in Brighton under the name Lawrence Davidson for the past 4 years. Moreover, he married a Mrs. Helen Crawford 2 years ago, making him a bigamist." Slack's words fell like stones into still water, creating ripples of shock that spread across both listeners' faces. Mrs. Dane collapsed onto the garden bench, her composure finally cracking completely. "Alive. Married. But the letters. He wrote to me, asked me to meet him. Did he indeed?" Slack's tone sharpened. "Because according to Brighton police, Captain Dane has been confined to his bed with pneumonia for the past 10 days. His wife confirms he hasn't left their lodgings." Gerald Ashford had gone very quiet, his earlier nervousness replaced by something that might have been calculation. Miss Marple observed the interplay of expressions with her characteristic attention to human nature, noting how each revelation seemed to affect the two suspects differently. "This means," Slack continued relentlessly, "that whoever met you in the churchyard, Mrs. Dane, was impersonating your husband. Someone who knew enough about your past to forge his handwriting convincingly and arrange a meeting that would establish an alibi for themselves while creating a perfect suspect." The full implications of this deception were staggering. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to create the illusion of Lawrence Dane's return, complete with forged letters and a carefully staged meeting. But the revelation that the real Captain Dane was safely in Brighton raised new questions about who had orchestrated such an elaborate fraud, and why. Miss Marple, watching the careful interplay of shock and calculation on both faces, found herself thinking of sealing wax warm from flame, of left-handed knots tied with deliberate precision, and of letters preserved with the same care that others had been destroyed. The pattern was becoming clearer, though its full implications remained troubling. As the official proceedings continued and the village began to buzz with news of these latest revelations, Miss Marple reflected that they were approaching the most dangerous phase of any investigation, the moment when the guilty party realizes their carefully constructed deception is beginning to unravel. Tomorrow, she suspected, would bring the sort of desperate action that would finally reveal the truth behind Lavinia Ashford's death. The game, as she had learned to think of these matters, was entering its final moves. The revelation about Captain Dane's true whereabouts settled over St. Mary Mead like morning mist, obscuring familiar landmarks and making everything seem somehow different. Miss Marple observed from her sitting-room window as Inspector Slack conducted increasingly intense interviews with both Mrs. Dane and Gerald Ashford, his notebook growing thicker with each conversation. The inspector's expression suggested a man wrestling with evidence that refused to arrange itself into the neat pattern he preferred. Mrs. Dane had retreated to Rose Cottage in a state of profound shock, her carefully maintained composure finally cracking under the weight of her husband's betrayal and the cruel deception that had been practiced upon her. Gerald Ashford, meanwhile, had taken rooms at the Red Lion Inn, his earlier nervousness replaced by something that might have been relief, or perhaps calculation. Miss Marple found this shift in his demeanor particularly telling, as if the exposure of the Lawrence Dane fraud had somehow freed him from a burden he had been carrying. The morning brought Dr. Haydock to Inspector Slack's makeshift headquarters with news that cast the investigation in an even more troubling light. "I've discovered something rather disturbing," he announced, his professional manner unable to entirely mask his personal distress. "My surgery was entered sometime yesterday evening. Nothing of obvious value was taken, but I'm missing a small quantity of digitalis tincture and several prescription slips. The lock on my medicine cabinet shows scratches consistent with forced entry." This revelation sent Miss Marple's mind racing along new pathways. Someone with considerable medical knowledge had administered just enough digitalis to disorient Lavinia without killing her outright, a calculated dose that suggested intimate familiarity with the drug's effects. Combined with the blow to the head that Dr. Haydock had identified as the actual cause of death, it painted a picture of a killer far more sophisticated than a desperate, returning husband. Inspector Slack absorbed this information with the grim satisfaction of a man seeing his suspicions confirmed. Professional knowledge, careful planning, and access to medical supplies. We're dealing with someone who understands both pharmacology and human psychology. His gaze drifted toward the Red Lion Inn, where Gerald Ashford could be seen pacing in the front garden with the restless energy of a caged animal. Miss Marple excused herself for what she described as a necessary errand. but her steps led her to Mary Crouch, Lavinia's daily help, whom she found in her tiny kitchen with a sort of agitated energy that comes from carrying secrets too heavy to bear alone. Mary's usual neat appearance was disheveled, her cap askew and her hands trembling as they worried at her apron strings. "Mary, dear," Miss Marple said gently, settling herself at the small wooden table. "You've been troubled since yesterday evening. Sometimes it helps to share what's weighing on one's mind." Mary's composure cracked like an eggshell and the words came tumbling out in a rush. "I went back to the cottage yesterday evening, Miss Marple. I'd forgotten my prayer book, you see, and I had my key. The cottage was dark, but I heard voices in the garden, Mrs. Ashford speaking very firmly to someone. 'This ends tonight,' she said. 'I won't be part of your deception any longer.'" Miss Marple's knitting needles stilled in her hands. "Could you see who she was speaking to?" "At first, no. They were standing in the shadows by the lavender bushes. But then the person stepped forward and I saw—" Mary's voice broke slightly. "It was Mr. Gerald, Miss Marple, but dressed in his late uncle's old coat and hat, trying to look like a stranger. I saw him take those letters from Mrs. Ashford, and when she tried to call out, he struck her with something. The garden spade, I think. Then he arranged everything to make it look like she'd collapsed naturally." The implications of Mary's testimony were staggering, but Miss Marple found herself unsurprised. The pattern had been emerging for some time. The left-handed knots, the forged letters, the elaborate deception designed to create a perfect suspect in the form of the supposedly returned Lawrence Dane. Their conversation was interrupted by Inspector Slack's arrival, bearing a telegram that brought additional confirmation of the web of deception that had been woven around Lavinia's death. "The forensic analysis of the sealing wax from the fireplace," he announced, "shows traces of a specific initial impressed in the softened wax, the letter G. And we've confirmed that the handwriting on the letters found beneath the lavender bush matches the samples we collected from the impersonator who met Mrs. Dane." Mary's testimony, combined with the mounting forensic evidence, painted a clear picture of Gerald's elaborate scheme. He had impersonated the dead Captain Dane to create a perfect suspect, using his knowledge of the man's handwriting and personal details to craft a deception that would have fooled anyone less observant than Miss Marple. But it was the discovery of a gentleman's umbrella in Lavender Cottage that provided the final piece of evidence. Mrs. Ferris at the post office had mentioned seeing the mysterious gentleman with an umbrella, and Mary confirmed finding one in the cottage's hall stand. A proper gentleman's umbrella with a silver ferrule bearing a distinctive chip and a streak of violet sealing wax. "The umbrella belongs to Gerald Ashford," Inspector Slack announced after examining it. "His initials are engraved inside the handle, and the wax matches the seal used on the forged letters. He left it behind in his haste to arrange the scene and create his alibi." As the evidence mounted, Gerald's carefully constructed facade began to crumble. When confronted with Mary's testimony and the physical evidence, his mask of grieving nephew finally slipped, revealing the cold calculation that had driven his elaborate deception. He had killed his aunt to inherit her considerable estate, but his plan had required the creation of a perfect scapegoat, the supposedly returned Lawrence Dane. Miss Marple, observing the final unraveling of Gerald's scheme, reflected on the complexity of human nature and the length to which greed and desperation could drive even the most seemingly respectable individuals. The game, as she had learned to think of these matters, was approaching its conclusion, but she suspected that the final revelations would prove even more shocking than what had already been uncovered. The truth about Lavinia Ashford's death lay not in the obvious explanation of a desperate man's return, but in the calculated greed of a nephew who had orchestrated one of the most elaborate murders St. Mary Mead had ever witnessed. Tomorrow, she knew, would bring the final confrontation that would expose the full extent of Gerald's deception and bring justice for the gentle woman who had died among her beloved lavender bushes. The morning brought with it an unusual stillness to St. Mary Mead, as if the village itself were holding its breath in anticipation of revelations yet to come. Miss Marple observed from her sitting-room window as Inspector Slack emerged from the Red Lion Inn, his expression suggesting a man wrestling with evidence that refused to arrange itself into the neat pattern he preferred. Gerald Ashford remained sequestered in the inn's private parlour, his earlier composure having given way to the restless energy of a man who sensed the walls closing in around him. Miss Marple made her decision with the quiet determination that had served her well through decades of unraveling human mysteries. She gathered her knitting bag and made her way across the green, her steps unhurried but purposeful. The time had come for a more direct approach, though she would maintain the gentle facade that had always been her greatest weapon in the pursuit of truth. She found Gerald in the parlour, attempting to read a London newspaper with hands that trembled slightly as they turned the pages. His eyes darted constantly toward the window, and when she entered, he started visibly, his carefully maintained mask slipping for just a moment before reasserting itself. "Good morning, Mr. Ashford," she said, her voice carrying the warmth of a concerned neighbour. "I hope I'm not intruding. I merely wish to express my condolences once more. Your aunt was such a dear woman, and her loss has affected us all deeply." Gerald rose with practiced courtesy, though his movements carried a stiffness that spoke of barely controlled tension. "Not at all, Miss Marple, though I must confess, these recent developments have made it difficult to focus on anything else. The inspector seems determined to pursue the most unlikely theories, rather than accepting the obvious explanation." Miss Marple settled herself in the offered chair, placing her knitting bag beside her with deliberate care. Her pale blue eyes, seemingly mild, fixed on Gerald with the sort of attention she might give to a particularly complex pattern. The obvious explanation, yes, though I've always found that the obvious explanation is sometimes the most deceptive. Rather like those magic tricks children perform, the hand that draws attention is rarely the one performing the actual trick. Gerald's grip tightened on his newspaper, creating small creases in the paper. "I'm afraid I don't follow your meaning, Miss Marple." "Oh, merely an old woman's musings," she replied with apparent innocence. "But I've been thinking about patterns, you see. The way certain details seem to align, almost as if they were carefully arranged. For instance, the timing of your arrival. Such a coincidence that you should come to visit your aunt just as these tragic events unfolded. I came for the harvest tea, as I mentioned. Aunt Lavinia specifically invited me." Gerald's response came too quickly, with the practiced ease of a well-rehearsed explanation. Miss Marple's knitting needles began their gentle rhythm, though her attention remained focused entirely on Gerald's face. "Of course, and yet Mrs. Ferris at the post office mentioned seeing a gentleman that evening, a gentleman who bore a remarkable resemblance to yourself. Left-handed, she noticed, in the way he held his umbrella and tipped his hat. Such a distinctive habit, don't you think?" The color drained from Gerald's face, though he attempted to maintain his composure. "Many people are left-handed, Miss Marple. It proves nothing whatsoever." "Indeed," she agreed mildly. "But then there are the other little details that seem to form such an interesting pattern. The sealing wax, for instance. That particular shade of violet that your aunt favored. We found traces of it in her fireplace, melted beyond recognition, and yet—" She paused, allowing the silence to stretch meaningfully. "There was a small droplet near the yew tree in the churchyard, barely visible unless one knew to look for it. The same distinctive color, with the faint impression of a letter G pressed into its surface." Gerald's cigarette fell from suddenly nerveless fingers, and he made no move to retrieve it. This is preposterous. You're suggesting—" "I'm merely observing," Miss Marple interrupted gently. "Observing the way evidence arranges itself when one pays attention to the smaller details. The digitalis, for example. Such a clever choice. Just enough to disorient and confuse, but not enough to kill outright. It would require considerable knowledge to calculate such a precise dose. Perhaps someone with access to medical supplies, or someone who understood the properties of certain garden plants." Gerald pushed back from the table abruptly. his chair scraping against the floor with a harsh sound that seemed to echo in the small room. "This is absurd. I have an alibi. I was on the train from London." Miss Marple's needles never paused in their rhythm. "Ah, yes, the train ticket. Such convenient proof of one's whereabouts. Though I've always wondered how difficult it might be to purchase a ticket. Perhaps even board a train briefly, and then disembark before it actually departed the station, particularly if one had urgent business to attend to elsewhere. You can't possibly believe. And then there's the matter of the letters," Miss Marple continued, her voice maintaining its gentle cadence despite the devastating nature of her observations. Such skillful forgeries, really. Someone had clearly studied Captain Dane's handwriting extensively, perhaps over many years of family correspondence, the sort of intimate knowledge that comes from careful observation and practice. Gerald's facade was cracking like ice under spring sunshine. Perspiration beaded on his forehead, and his hands trembled as he reached for another cigarette. "I barely knew the man. He visited us a few times, nothing more." "Of course," Miss Marple murmured. "Though Mrs. Dane mentioned how interested you were in family correspondence during those visits. Such attention to detail, collecting letters and documents. One might say you were quite the student of handwriting styles." She looked up from her knitting then, her eyes meeting his with the sort of penetrating gaze that seemed to see straight through to the soul. "Your aunt was left-handed, you know. She always tied her ribbons in that particular way, the knot slightly askew as left-handed people often do, just like the knot on those letters we found beneath the lavender bush. And you, Mr. Ashford, share that same distinctive trait." Gerald's composure shattered completely. He lunged forward, not at Miss Marple, but at the newspaper, crumpling it into a tight ball with savage intensity. His breath came in ragged gasps, his face a mask of fury and desperation. "You interfering old woman, you don't understand anything. She was going to ruin me, change her will, leave everything to charity. I couldn't let that happen." The words hung in the air like smoke from a spent gun, their implications reverberating through the small room. Miss Marple observed him with the calm attention of someone who had seen this moment approaching from the very beginning, her knitting needles continuing their gentle rhythm even as Gerald's world collapsed around him. "She fell," he whispered, his voice breaking. "It was an accident. She was old, frail." But even as he spoke the words, his eyes held the desperate knowledge that his carefully constructed deception had finally been exposed. Miss Marple had played her psychological game with the patience of a master chess player, and now, with Gerald's defenses crumbling, the final revelation was at hand. The understated genius had found its mark, and the truth about Lavinia Ashford's death was finally ready to emerge from the shadows where it had been hidden. The game, as she had always thought of these matters, was approaching its inevitable conclusion. Gerald's partial confession hung in the morning air like smoke from a spent fire, acrid with implication, yet incomplete in its truth. Miss Marple observed him with the patient attention of someone who understood that desperate people rarely reveal everything at once, preferring instead to parcel out their admissions like a miser counting coins. His claim that Lavinia's death was accidental struck her as the sort of half-truth that guilty conscience's construct, close enough to reality to feel believable, yet distant enough from the full horror to remain bearable. "An accident," she repeated gently, her knitting needles resuming their steady rhythm despite the gravity of the moment. "And yet you felt compelled to create such an elaborate deception afterward. The forged letters, the impersonation of Captain Dane, the careful arrangement of evidence, all to cover up what you claim was merely an unfortunate mishap." Gerald's hands trembled as he reached for another cigarette, the flame of his lighter wavering like his resolve. "You don't understand the pressure I was under, the debts, the creditors threatening everything I'd worked for. Aunt Lavinia was my only hope, and when she told me about her plans to change the will, to leave everything to charity—" His voice trailed off, the weight of his actions settling upon him like a burial shroud. Miss Marple's pale blue eyes never left his face, reading the subtle shifts in expression that revealed far more than his carefully chosen words. But it wasn't simply about the inheritance, was it? She discovered something about you, something that made her reconsider her generous intentions toward her nephew. The effect of this observation was immediate and devastating. Gerald's cigarette fell from suddenly nerveless fingers, his face going ashen as if she had struck him physically. The careful mask he had maintained throughout the investigation finally began to crack, revealing glimpses of the desperate, calculating man beneath. "She found the letters," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the morning sounds filtering through the inn's windows. "The real letters from Captain Dane, the ones I'd been collecting and studying for years." She realized I'd been forging his handwriting, practicing, perfecting it. She knew I'd been planning this deception for months, waiting for the right moment to use it. Miss Marple absorbed this admission with the careful attention of someone assembling the final pieces of a complex puzzle. The pattern was becoming crystal clear now, painted in shades of premeditation that made Gerald's actions all the more chilling. You'd been collecting his correspondence during his visits to your family, studying the distinctive way he formed his letters, the particular quirks of his handwriting, the bold capitals, the curved tail on the letter Y, the small flourish on the R, all carefully observed and practiced until you could reproduce them perfectly. Gerald nodded miserably, his confession beginning to pour out like water from a broken dam. At first, it was just insurance. I knew about Aunt Lavinia's fondness for the captain, her sympathy for his widow. I thought if I could create the impression that he was still alive and in need, I might be able to access her funds without suspicion. But then I learned about her plans for the codicil, and suddenly my insurance policy became something far more sinister. The codicil that would have provided for Mrs. Dane while acknowledging a debt to LD, a debt that, in your aunt's mind, represented your own manipulative demands for money, Miss Marple continued, her voice maintaining its gentle cadence despite the horror of the revelation. That would have exposed your deception and cut you out of the inheritance entirely. She was going to leave everything to charity. Gerald's voice rose with the desperate intensity of a man justifying the unjustifiable. Everything. The cottage, the investments, even the family jewelry. She said I'd proven myself unworthy of the Ashford name, that my gambling debts and associations with unsavory creditors had convinced her I would squander her legacy within months. Miss Marple's knitting needles stilled as she absorbed the calculated cruelty of what had unfolded. "So, you arranged to meet her that evening, perhaps suggesting you had something important to discuss, that you were ready to reform your ways. She trusted you enough to meet you in her garden, among the lavender bushes she loved so dearly." Gerald's face crumpled as the full weight of his betrayal crashed down upon him. I'd already stolen the digitalis from Dr. Haydock's surgery that afternoon, knowing he would be at the harvest tea. I told her it was medicine for my nerves, asked her to prepare tea for us both while I gathered my courage to confess my troubles. She was so trusting, so eager to believe I had changed, so willing to help her troubled nephew one final time. And while she was disoriented from the digitalis, Miss Marple said quietly, "You struck her with the garden spade, not hard enough to appear obviously violent, but precisely calculated to cause fatal injury while maintaining the appearance of an accidental fall." "It wasn't supposed to kill her," Gerald protested, though his words rang hollow even to his own ears. "I just needed her unconscious long enough to search for the new will, to destroy it before it could be signed. But she realized what was happening, tried to call for help, and He buried his face in his hands, unable to complete the admission that would seal his fate. Miss Marple observed him with the sort of compassionate understanding that came from decades of witnessing human frailty in all its forms. "Then you implemented your carefully prepared deception. You burned most of the letters to eliminate evidence of your forgery practice, but preserved a few to establish the fiction of Captain Dane's return. You dressed in your uncle's old clothes, complete with the umbrella you left behind in your haste, to become the mysterious gentleman Mrs. Ferris observed at the post office." The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of revealed truth. Gerald's shoulders shook with silent sobs as the full enormity of his actions became undeniable. "You used the violet sealing wax," Miss Marple continued inexorably, "heating it with your cigarette lighter, which left that distinctive droplet near the yew tree, still warm enough to burn Mrs. Dane's hand when you touched her while impersonating her supposedly dead husband. The same wax that melted in your aunt's fireplace, bearing the impression of your signet ring. You hoped to create such a web of circumstantial evidence that the police would immediately suspect Lawrence Dane, or at the very least, Mrs. Dane herself." Gerald looked up at her with a mixture of terror and grudging admiration. "How could you possibly know all this, every detail, every small deception? How did you see through it all?" Miss Marple's needles resumed their gentle rhythm, providing a counterpoint to the devastation of Gerald's revealed guilt. "Human nature, my dear, is surprisingly consistent. Small details, when observed carefully, often tell the largest stories. The way you struck that match with your left hand, the specific knot on the ribbon that matched your aunt's own left-handed technique, the particular shade of sealing wax, the umbrella with your initials engraved inside the handle. These are the threads that, when pulled, unravel the entire tapestry of deceit." As if summoned by her words, Inspector Slack appeared in the doorway, his expression suggesting he had heard enough of Gerald's confession to understand the full scope of the deception that had been practiced upon them all. His notebook was already in hand, his manner carrying the weight of official authority. "Mr. Ashford," Slack said, his voice taking on the formal tone of legal proceedings, "I believe we need to continue this conversation at the station. Constable Barnes will accompany us, and I must caution you that anything further you say may be used in evidence." Gerald offered no resistance as Barnes stepped forward, his carefully constructed world having crumbled around him like a house built on sand. The grieving nephew, the concerned family member, the innocent victim of circumstance. All these masks had been stripped away, revealing the calculating killer beneath. As Gerald was led away, his footsteps heavy with the weight of inevitable justice, Miss Marple remained in the quiet parlor, her knitting providing a soothing rhythm in the aftermath of revelation. The game, as she had learned to think of these matters, was approaching its final conclusion. The truth about Lavinia Ashford's death had been exposed at last, though its implications would continue to reverberate through St. Mary Mead long after the immediate drama had subsided. The village would return to its ordinary routines, but the memory of gentle Lavinia and the calculated betrayal that had led to her death among the lavender she loved would linger like a cautionary tale about the depths to which human greed and desperation could sink, even in the most peaceful of English villages. The sight of Gerald Ashford being led away in handcuffs cast a peculiar spell over St. Mary Mead, as if the village itself were exhaling after, holding its breath through days of mounting tension. Miss Marple observed from the Red Lion's window as Inspector Slack supervised the prisoner's departure, noting how Gerald's earlier composure had completely deserted him. The carefully constructed mask of the grieving nephew had finally crumbled, revealing the calculating killer beneath. When Inspector Slack returned to the parlor, his expression carried the satisfaction of a case well solved, yet Miss Marple detected something else in his manner, a nagging sense that certain details required further examination. She had learned to recognize this particular expression in policemen, the look of someone who understood the crime but remained troubled by its mechanics. "Miss Marple," Slack began, settling himself in the chair Gerald had so recently vacated, "there's still the matter of the actual weapon. Dr. Haydock maintains that the blow was precise, almost surgical in its placement, yet Mary Crouch insists she saw Gerald strike his aunt with the garden spade. The spade we examined, however, shows no traces of blood or tissue, and the wound pattern doesn't quite match." Miss Marple's knitting needles resumed their gentle rhythm as she considered this forensic puzzle. "Inspector, I believe Mary saw what she expected to see in poor lighting conditions. The garden spade would be the obvious choice for someone wishing to make a murder appear accidental. But consider the umbrella, that proper gentleman's umbrella with its distinctive silver ferrule and that small but significant chip. Slack's eyebrows rose as understanding dawned. You think the umbrella was the actual weapon? I'm quite certain of it, Miss Marple replied with quiet confidence. A spade would leave a broader, more irregular wound and would be difficult to clean thoroughly. But an umbrella's ferrule, particularly one with a sharp chip, would create precisely the sort of focused trauma Dr. Haydick described. And afterwards, Gerald simply returned it to the hall stand where it belonged, hiding in plain sight, as it were. The inspector made careful notes, his appreciation for Miss Marple's observational skills growing with each revelation. That would explain why he carried it on such a clear evening. Not for weather protection, but as a weapon that wouldn't attract suspicion. Their discussion was interrupted by the arrival of Mrs. Ferris from the post office, bearing her meticulous ledger and wearing the expression of someone who had discovered information of considerable importance. "Inspector," she announced breathlessly, "you asked about money orders, and I've found something rather disturbing. Over the past 18 months, Mrs. Ashford purchased nearly 24 money orders, all made payable to a Mr. Lawrence Davidson in Brighton, totaling more than £300. This revelation sent Miss Marple's mind racing along new pathways. The pattern was becoming even clearer. Gerald had been systematically draining his aunt's resources using the alias of the very man he would later impersonate in his elaborate deception. The LD mentioned in Lavinia's diary entries wasn't referring to Lawrence Dane directly, but to Gerald himself, operating under the false identity of Lawrence Davidson. He created the perfect cover for his extortion, Miss Marple observed quietly. By using the real Captain Dane's Brighton alias, he could extract money from his aunt while establishing the very identity he would later use to frame a dead man for murder. Inspector Slack absorbed this information with grim satisfaction. So when Mrs. Ashford discovered his forgery practice and threatened to expose him, Gerald realized his entire scheme was about to collapse. The codicils she planned to sign would have not only disinherited him, but also revealed the systematic fraud he'd been perpetrating. Mrs. Dane appeared at the parlor door at that moment, her earlier distress having given way to a composed determination. She carried a small valise and wore the expression of someone who had made difficult but necessary decisions. "Inspector, I wanted to thank you before I leave for London. And Miss Marple, I owe you a debt of gratitude for seeing through the deception that made me an unwitting accomplice." Miss Marple's expression softened with genuine sympathy. "My dear, you were as much a victim as your poor aunt. Gerald's scheme required someone to play the role of the grieving widow, and your genuine emotions lent credibility to his fiction." As Mrs. Dane departed for the station, Inspector Slack turned his attention to the final pieces of evidence. The bank manager, summoned with considerable reluctance, confirmed the substantial withdrawals from Lavinia's accounts, all noted as private charitable obligations. The pattern of escalating demands painted a clear picture of Gerald's increasing desperation as his debts mounted and his creditors grew more threatening. Dr. Haydick arrived with his final medical report, confirming that the umbrella's dimensions matched the wound pattern perfectly. "The chip in the ferrule created a distinctive mark," he explained. "Combined with the digitalis poisoning, it created the perfect storm. Disorientation, followed by a precisely calculated blow that would appear accidental to casual examination." Miss Marple found herself reflecting on the intricate web of deception Gerald had woven, using his knowledge of family history and his aunt's past vulnerabilities to create an elaborate fraud that had ultimately led to murder. The young man had possessed considerable intelligence and planning ability, yet had been undone by the very attention to detail that had made his scheme so elaborate. "There's something almost tragic about it," she murmured to Inspector Slack as they prepared to leave the inn. Gerald had the intelligence to succeed honestly, yet chose instead to build his life on a foundation of lies and manipulation. His aunt's kindness, which, should have been his salvation, became instead the instrument of her own destruction. As evening approached, Inspector Slack made arrangements for the final gathering that would bring the case to its formal conclusion. The key witnesses and participants would assemble at Lavender Cottage, where Miss Marple would provide the comprehensive explanation that would tie together all the threads of Gerald's elaborate deception. The game, as she had learned to think of these matters, was approaching its final moves. Tomorrow, the village would begin the slow process of healing from the shock of murder in their midst. But tonight would bring the sort of revelation that would satisfy the human need to understand how such carefully hidden evil could flourish in the most peaceful of settings. The truth about Lavinia Ashford's death among her beloved lavender bushes was finally ready to be revealed in all its calculated cruelty and tragic waste. The lamps burned softly in Lavender Cottage as Inspector Slack assembled the key figures whose lives had been touched by Lavinia Ashford's tragic end. Miss Marple settled herself in the familiar sitting room, her knitting bag beside her and her pale blue eyes reflecting the gravity of the moment. The cottage still carried the faint scent of lavender, a bittersweet reminder of the gentle woman who had tended her garden with such devotion, never suspecting that her beloved nephew was orchestrating her destruction among the very flowers she cherished. Dr. Haydock stood near the window, his expression grave with the knowledge of his unwitting contribution to the crime. Mary Crouch twisted her apron nervously, while Mrs. Ferris clutched her meticulous ledger. Mrs. Bantry occupied the chair nearest Miss Marple, her usual bustling energy subdued by the weight of revelation. Mrs. Dane, having returned from London, sat quietly composed, her ordeal as an unwitting pawn in Gerald's scheme written in the shadows beneath her eyes. "We have gathered," Miss Marple began, her voice carrying the gentle authority that had served her through decades of unraveling human mysteries, "to understand how such calculated evil could flourish beneath our very noses, disguised as familial devotion and wrapped in the most elaborate deception I have ever encountered." She paused, allowing her words to settle like dust motes in the lamplight. Gerald Ashford's crime began not on the evening of his aunt's death, but 18 months earlier, when he discovered that Captain Lawrence Dane had been living in Brighton under the assumed name Lawrence Davidson. Rather than exposing this bigamy, Gerald saw opportunity. He began systematically defrauding his aunt, using his considerable skill at forgery to impersonate the captain and extract money through carefully crafted appeals for help. Mrs. Ferris nodded grimly, her ledger open to pages of money orders that told their own damning story. "Over £300, she murmured. "All sent to Brighton, all based on lies." "Indeed," Miss Marple continued, but Lavinia was not the trusting fool Gerald believed her to be. Her growing suspicions led her to Brighton, where she discovered the truth, a healthy, prosperous man who had never written to her for assistance. She realized immediately that someone with intimate knowledge of the captain's handwriting had been systematically deceiving her. Dr. Haydock leaned forward, his professional interest engaged despite his personal distress. And when she threatened to expose him, Gerald knew his time was running out. The codicil Lavinia planned to sign would not only disinherit him entirely, but also acknowledge the debt to LD, revealing his fraudulent extractions to the world. He could not allow that to happen. Miss Marple's knitting needles began their gentle rhythm. So he devised perhaps the most elaborate murder scheme I have ever encountered. She looked around the assembled group, ensuring she had their complete attention. On the day of the harvest tea, Gerald stole digitalis from Dr. Haydock's surgery. Not enough to kill immediately, but precisely calculated to disorient and incapacitate. He arranged to meet his aunt in the garden that evening, claiming he wished to confess his troubles and seek forgiveness. While she prepared tea for them both, trusting in her nephew's apparent repentance, he administered the poison. Mary Crouch shuddered. "I saw him strike her with the garden spade, Miss Marple. I'm certain of it." "You saw what you expected to see in poor lighting conditions, my dear," Miss Marple replied kindly. Gerald wanted witnesses to observe him with a garden tool, establishing the fiction of an accidental death. But the actual weapon was far more subtle. His gentleman's umbrella, with its distinctive chipped ferrule that matched the wound pattern perfectly. After ensuring his aunt was dead, he simply returned it to the hall stand, hidden in plain sight. Inspector Slack consulted his notes. And then came the elaborate cover-up. Precisely. Gerald burned most of the forged letters to eliminate evidence of his practice, but carefully preserved a few to establish the fiction of Captain Dane's return. He dressed in his uncle's old clothes, complete with umbrella, and became the mysterious gentleman who met Mrs. Dane in the churchyard. Miss Marple's voice carried a note of sadness. He used her genuine grief and confusion to lend credibility to his deception, knowing that her shock at seeing her supposedly dead husband would convince everyone of Lawrence Dane's return. Mrs. Dane pressed her handkerchief to her lips, remembering the cruel manipulation she had endured. The sealing wax warmed by his cigarette lighter, the left-handed knot that matched his aunt's own technique, the letters placed so carefully beneath the lavender bush. Every detail was calculated to direct suspicion toward a dead man. Miss Marple's eyes held the satisfaction of a puzzle finally solved. But Gerald underestimated both his aunt's intelligence and the power of small, overlooked details. The umbrella with his initials engraved inside the handle, the precise knowledge of digitalis dosages, the relief rather than grief when his deception was exposed. These small things, when observed carefully, told the larger story. The room fell silent as the full scope of Gerald's betrayal became clear. Inspector Slack closed his notebook with an air of finality, the case now complete in all its tragic complexity. "What strikes me most profoundly," Miss Marple said softly, "is the waste of it all. Gerald possessed considerable intelligence and planning ability, yet chose to build his life on deception and manipulation. His aunt's kindness, which should have been his salvation, became instead the instrument of her destruction." As the gathering began to disperse, Miss Marple remained for a moment longer, breathing in the sweet scent of the garden beyond. The lavender bushes continued to bloom, indifferent to the human drama that had played out among them, offering their fragrance as a gentle memorial to the woman who had tended them with such care. Gerald Ashford would face justice for his calculated betrayal, but the true tragedy lay in the corruption of family bonds by greed and desperation. St. Mary Mead would heal, as villages always do, but the memory of Lavinia and her lavender letters would linger as a reminder that even in the most tranquil settings, human nature remained capable of both extraordinary kindness and unspeakable cruelty. The game, as Miss Marple had learned to think of these matters, was finally concluded.